Did you know that there is an African god so powerful that Yahweh had to declare war on him and erase his existence from sacred history? Tension sound. This secret has been hidden for millennia, until now. Do you truly believe you know the whole truth behind the Bible? Have you ever stopped to think about the deities that were erased, the forbidden rituals, the names erased by those who wrote and rewrote the sacred scriptures? What if I told you that an African god was considered so dangerous, so defiant to the power of Yahweh, that his memory had to be exterminated? You are about to discover one of the best-kept secrets of the spiritual war between Yahweh and the ancient deities of the African continent. A silent conflict that spanned centuries, left its mark on the history of faith, but was systematically erased from your Bible, your church, and your doctrine. Before Moses, before the Hebrew prophets, even before the Torah was written, Africa was already sacred ground. Did you know that civilizations like Egypt, Ethiopia, Cush, and Canaan had their own spiritual codes, that they worshipped powerful gods with complex rituals, cosmic visions, and a connection to the divine that deeply troubled the new religious empires? Among these ancient entities there existed a god whose name almost no one knows anymore. He was a symbol of wisdom, power, and spiritual presence, but in the eyes of Yahweh, he was a threat, an affront, a rebellion against the fidelity demanded of the Hebrew people. And so began an invisible war, a spiritual war. Have you ever heard of gods who have been demonized throughout history? Have you noticed how dominant religions transformed deities from ancient cultures into pagan idols or evil spirits? Well, this African god was a victim of exactly that. His cult was destroyed, his texts were burned, his temples defaced, and his name was completely erased from the Bible. But why did this happen? What did Yahweh see in him that made him so dangerous? Why did the biblical authors go to great lengths to erase this trace? The answer is hidden in rejected scrolls, in stifled oral traditions, in forgotten artifacts that have never reached your eyes. But today, you will see, you will hear, you will feel the impact of this revelation. And perhaps you realize that the faith you carry today was built on missing parts, on silences that should never have existed, on a spiritual war that no one told you about. Are you ready to look beyond what you've been taught, to question the official version of sacred history? Because what we're about to reveal now isn't just another biblical detail. It's a game changer. It's a gateway to something much deeper than religion. So take a deep breath. Stay with me until the end. Because the truth, the real truth, is about to be unearthed. And now that you've come this far, I need to ask you, what do you think motivated Yahweh to erase this god from history? Do you believe the truth is still being hidden? Or is it past time we revisited what we were taught as absolute? Leave your comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective. This topic isn't just intriguing, it's profound, spiritual, and has implications that directly touch how you view faith, history, and your own identity. This video was carefully crafted to make you think, and if it did in any way, please leave a like. It's a simple gesture, but it shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people like you. And if this is the kind of revelation you want to continue exploring, subscribe to the channel now. This is just the beginning. We're building together a journey of discovery, spirituality, and paradigm liberation. Ring the bell too, because the next videos will reveal other forgotten gods, other passages erased from the Bible, and other spiritual wars that changed the course of faith, but that almost no one dares to talk about. Now it's up to you. Comment, like, share, and get ready, because what comes next will leave you even more uneasy. To understand why Yahweh would have declared war on an African god and why that name was erased from history, you must first understand the spiritual landscape of the time, a landscape far more complex, profound, and ancient than most people imagine or know. The Bible, as it has come down to us, is just one version of the story. And no, this is not a critique of faith, but a provocation to the search for truth. The complete truth does not fear investigation, and it almost always resides in the details that have been silenced. Before the emergence of Hebrew monotheism, the spiritual world was a sea of deities, forces, rituals, and parallel realities. It wasn't confusion, it was diversity. And in this ocean of spirituality, Africa was one of the most vibrant and most spiritually advanced continents. You need to know that Africa was not only the cradle of humanity, but also the birthplace of religious systems. mythologies, and gods that influenced much of the construction of the spiritual imagination that would come later, including the biblical text itself. Civilizations like Egypt, Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Cush, Nubia, and the Canaanite peoples were not primitive or pagan peoples, as many still insist. They had complex worldviews, ethical and spiritual codes, celestial calendars, and a perception of the divine based on the harmony between natural forces, ancestry, and the invisible world. For them, the sacred was in everything: in the river, the mountain, the sun, the serpent, the tree, the woman giving birth, the wind touching their skin. It's impossible to talk about ancient African faith without mentioning Egypt, or Kemet, as it was called in its original language. There was a pantheon of gods who personified essential elements of life and the cosmos: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, Thoth, Ra. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What few people know is that many of these concepts were later incorporated or adapted into Hebrew, Christian, and even Islamic traditions, but with different names, different guises, and often with the original gods recast as villains or demons. In Ethiopia, for example, monotheism already existed in a syncretic form, parallel to the worship of intermediary forces, spiritual entities that functioned as guardians of heaven, long before the concept of angels took hold in the Western imagination. In Cush, kings were not merely politicians or military figures. They were priests and interpreters of the sacred. They were chosen by the gods, and the gods spoke through them. These cultures saw no separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. Time was cyclical, ancestors were alive in memory, and rituals were performed to maintain the balance between visible and invisible forces. This explains why, when the Hebrews began to form their monotheistic identity under Yahweh, they encountered an obstacle in these African cultures, not just political, but spiritual. It wasn't just about land, it was about spiritual dominion, about who was worthy of worship, about who had the true power to speak on behalf of the divine. This is where things start to get really tricky, because if Yahweh were just another tribal god seeking space among the others, as was common at the time, there would be no conflict. But Yahweh demands exclusivity. "You shall have no other gods before me" is not just a commandment. It is a declaration of war, an imposition of spiritual sovereignty. What many don't understand is that monotheism arises not in a vacuum, but as a direct rupture with this plural spiritual world. And if there is a rupture, there is rejection. And if there is rejection, there is persecution. In practice, this meant that every god other than Yahweh was labeled false, evil, or demonic. And here comes the darkest part. African gods, many of whom had been revered for millennia by people seeking wisdom, balance, healing, and connection with the cosmos, were persecuted. Their names were erased. Their priests were murdered. Their temples were destroyed. Their histories were rewritten. But how do you erase a god from the collective memory of an entire people? How do you erase from history a name that has lived for generations in sacred songs, dances, symbols, and spiritual visions? It's not enough to prohibit. It must be replaced. And that's exactly what happened. In many biblical texts, you'll see Yahweh ordering his followers to destroy the altars of other gods, not to bow down to Baal, Ashtoreth, Moloch, Dagon. But how many of these names do you actually know? How many have been renamed to appear as just unimportant idols? And how many have been hidden completely? Among these gods was one in particular, a name that rarely appears anymore, an African god revered for centuries, feared by spiritual enemies, associated with fertility, justice, ancestry, and inner strength. The relationship between this god and Yahweh was more than an ideological confrontation. It was a war of dominance, a battle for the soul of the people. Yahweh, demanding exclusivity, could not allow this god to coexist to any degree. He had to disappear. But how can the sacred be completely erased? How can something that also lives in the bones, blood, memory, and spirit of people be destroyed? No matter how much the texts were modified, no matter how much the scribes rewrote history under orders from the dominant religious power, no matter how much they burned the records and cursed the name of this god, he continued to exist, in echoes, in syncretized rituals, in oral legends passed down in the whispers of villages, in symbols that survived hidden in the fabrics, designs, names, and customs of generations that followed. That's why African spirituality didn't die. It went into hiding. It changed form. It migrated to enslaved bodies, to slave ships, to hidden toreros, to disguised churches. Today, many who worship unknowingly repeat fragments of this god. They sing, dance, pray, but without knowing where this sacred impulse came from. And now that you've come this far, you need to make a choice. Continue accepting the official narrative you've been given, or open your eyes to the layers of a story that hasn't been fully told. You need to understand that spirituality is much more than institutional religion. It's heritage, it's memory, it's a connection to something greater and older than most dare admit. Now tell me, have you ever heard of these gods? Do you believe that Yahweh waged a spiritual war to wipe African deities off the map? Or do you think this is all just legend? Comment below. The truth was hidden, but now it's beginning to be revealed. If this content made you think, and share your thoughts on this story. Your insight may inspire others. Your feedback is important so we can continue unearthing these truths that have been buried by religion and forgotten by tradition. I'll be waiting for your opinion, because what comes next is even more profound. When you begin to understand what was truly at stake, it becomes clear that it wasn't just a matter of culture or differences of belief. It was something much deeper, much more spiritual, and much more dangerous for those seeking total control over a people's faith. Yahweh, the God of Israel, didn't just position himself as one among many. He imposed himself as the only one. And any other god, entity, force, or spiritual symbol that dared to divide the worship, devotion, and loyalty of the people was automatically considered an enemy. But why? What was so threatening about these African gods that made Yahweh see them not just as competitors but as enemies to be exterminated? The Old Testament is replete with passages that demonstrate this spiritual tension. On numerous occasions, Yahweh orders the total destruction of entire peoples, not only because of their moral practices or social behavior, but because they served other gods. Absolute fidelity was demanded, and any form of syncretism, mixing, or tolerance with other deities was treated as spiritual betrayal. The case of the Canaanites, for example, is one of the most emblematic. A people with Afro-Asian roots, with their own religious practices, worship of gods like Baal and Ashtoreth, deeply connected to the fertility of the land, the lunar cycles, and the feminine nature of the divine. But for Yahweh, this connection was unacceptable. It was impurity. It was abomination. And what does he command? Extermination, not just of the gods, but of their followers. Men, women, children, animals. Everything was to be destroyed. The name of these gods was to be erased from the mouths of the people. Their altars were to be torn down. Their statues were to be broken. Their practices were to be cursed. In Deuteronomy 12, for example, it is written, "You shall utterly destroy all the places where the people you are about to dispossess serve their gods. You shall tear down their altars, break down their sacred pillars, and burn their Asherah poles with fire." In other words, Yahweh was not only interested in physically eliminating a people, but also in completely erasing their spiritual heritage. A true sacred war for dominion and absolute fidelity. And this wasn't the only time. In Numbers 21 and Judges, we see Yahweh guiding the people to destroy the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Midianites, all peoples with their own spiritual roots, with gods that rivaled each other in symbolic, ritualistic, and cultural power. And here's where the key point that almost no one talks about comes in. Many of these peoples had gods of African origin, or deep connections to the continent's spiritual systems. Some scholars, and even occult archaeological evidence, suggest that names like Molech, Dagon, and even Baal had ancestral roots older than Hebrew tradition. They were gods who represented aspects that Yahweh did not accept: the body as a spiritual portal, the woman as a sacred symbol, the earth as a divine mother, the sun and moon as conscious entities. For Yahweh, who demanded total obedience, this was an affront. It was a real threat. The presence of these gods posed a direct threat to the spiritual purity he sought to establish. Imagine trying to consolidate a people, a nation, a faith, amidst so many active and vibrant spiritual systems. Either you conquer or you are absorbed. And Yahweh chose to conquer, but not through dialogue, through war, a relentless spiritual war. The enemy was not just the enemy army. It was the altar. It was the temple. It was the ritual music. It was the memory of ancestors. It was the language spoken in trance. It was the African god revered in silence for centuries. These gods were not weak. They were powerful spiritual entities, connected to the land, ancestry, fertility, and the protection of their people. They did not demand submission. They offered balance. They did not threaten eternal punishment, but rather spiritual imbalance if the connection with nature and ancestors was broken. This created a spirituality of communion, identity, and belonging. And Yahweh could not allow this, because the more a people connected with their spiritual roots, the less manipulable they became, less controllable, less dependent on priests and hierarchical religious systems. Are you beginning to understand now why Yahweh took such a radical stance? Why did he demand that every altar be destroyed? Because he knew that unless there was a complete break with the old gods, the people would never fully surrender. Partial fidelity was not enough. Mixed obedience was unacceptable. It was all or nothing, and this imposed choice generated bloodshed, fear, silencing, and oblivion. But no matter how much the records have been erased, no matter how much the names have been banished from official texts, traces remain between the lines of the verses. In Yahweh's obsessive repetition of banning certain cults, in the almost desperate fear that the people would return to the old gods. It's as if Yahweh were constantly fighting something that was still alive, as if the spiritual presence of these gods hadn't been completely eliminated. And perhaps it hadn't been. Perhaps these gods are still alive. Perhaps their names echo in forgotten chants, in camouflaged rituals, in practices that persist in the shadows. Perhaps you've already felt something, an energy, a presence, a vibration that can't be explained in the words of traditional religion. Perhaps the spiritual war is still raging, not in the pages of the Bible but in your consciousness. And perhaps this is the time to ask, to whom is your allegiance? How much of your spirituality has been shaped by imposition and fear? How many gods have you been taught to hate, without ever truly knowing them? Comment below if this resonated with you. Write, the spiritual war still rages, if this message resonated with you. And if you believe this story needs to be told, like this video, share it with someone who also deserves to be awakened. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do so now, because what comes next will further challenge what you think you know about faith, power, and who really wrote history. Having reached this point in our spiritual investigation, it's no longer possible to ignore the fact that there was a silent war waged between Yahweh and other entities that occupied the imagination, cults, and hearts of ancient peoples. But now, more than understanding the reason for this spiritual war, it's time to face the question many are afraid to even ask. After all, who was this erased god? What deity was considered so threatening, so powerful, so influential, that it needed to be destroyed, banished, rewritten, or simply erased from sacred history? We're not talking about generic myths. We're talking about a real spiritual being, worshipped by millions of people for centuries. An African god, worshipped by ancient civilizations, present in chants, rituals, symbols carved in stone and engraved on skin, in the names given to children, and in secrets passed down from generation to generation. This god had an identity, a function, a presence, and many believe to this day that he is still alive, albeit under different names, camouflaged in syncretized traditions and occult spiritual practices. Among the names most frequently mentioned, even if distorted, in the Bible and ancient texts, some stand out with a mysterious weight: Baal, Moloch, Dagon. You've probably heard these names before, always associated with negative, demonized, or cursed images. But is this how these gods were originally viewed by their people? Or was their image purposefully tarnished to serve a larger plan of spiritual erasure and domination? Baal, for example, is portrayed in Scripture as Yahweh's greatest rival. But what many overlook is that Baal was a god of fertility, rain, and harvest, a highly respected deity among the Canaanites, a people with deep African roots. He was a symbol of provision, of balance between nature and humanity. His worship involved dances, natural offerings, and a connection with the cycles of time and the body. For those who worshipped him, he was not an enemy of Yahweh. He was the provider of life. And why then did he become so hated in the sacred texts? Because Baal represented everything Yahweh demanded to be replaced. A god who was close, earthly, connected to the earth and the body, accessible without intermediaries. In other words, Baal needed no exclusive priesthood, no centralized temple, nor fear as a tool of control. This was dangerous for the religious system that was forming around Yahweh. And so, Baal was transformed from a vital deity into a false idol. The image that has come down to us has been filtered, distorted, and condemned, but traces of his true role still endure. Another intriguing name is Molech, or Moloch, as it appears in some translations. This name has been associated with human sacrifice and violent practices, but a body of spiritual and historical scholarship points to a falsification of this image. Molech may have been a god linked to justice and spiritual judgment, an ancestral spirit who protected the innocent and punished lies. He was feared, yes, but as one fears a guardian, a zealous ancestor. In many African traditions, there are entities with similar characteristics, figures who represent cosmic justice, the balance between good and evil, and who are invoked not to be flattered, but to maintain the spiritual order of the community. Dagon is another name that appears shrouded in mist. Known as the god of the Philistines, he is portrayed as an evil figure. But what if, behind this name, lies one of the ancient aquatic entities worshipped by coastal peoples of Africa and the Near East? Dagon may have been a deity linked to the abundance of the seas, the cycle of marine life, and spiritual renewal through water. A clear parallel to African aquatic entities such as Mami Wata or Olokun, who are still revered today in rituals of purification, prosperity, and protection. But the most intriguing thing of all is realizing how these entities, even though officially erased, continue to influence the modern world. Have you ever stopped to think about how many African spiritual practices were syncretized in Brazil, the Caribbean, Latin America, and even parts of Europe, blending Christian names with Orishas, Vodans, Incases, and other entities from the Black Continent? Oxóssi as Saint Sebastian, Yemanja as Our Lady of Conception, Zango as Saint Jerome. This blending wasn't coincidence, it was resistance. The God erased by Yahweh may not have a single name. He may have many. He may have changed form, divided into aspects, adapted to survive, but his essence remains, the ancestral African power that represents the connection between the human and the divine, without intermediaries, without fear, without oppression. And here's something even deeper. Perhaps this erased God is closer to you than you imagine. Perhaps you've felt him in moments of spiritual intuition, in powerful dreams, in rituals you've witnessed but couldn't explain. Perhaps he's calling to you now, through this video, awakening within you an ancestral memory that's illogical but powerful, a spiritual memory that has survived even after centuries of erasure. Can you now grasp the magnitude of this revelation? How much it can change the way you look at the Bible, your faith, and the spiritual world. And this isn't about exchanging one God for another. It's not about heresy, nor about abandoning belief. It's about seeing beyond the official version. It's about recognizing the layers that have been hidden. It's about having the courage to ask, why so much fear of an African god? Now that you know that names like Baal, Molech, and Dagon can hide much deeper truths, which may have been distorted to protect systems, institutions, and dogmas. I want to know what you feel about this. Leave a comment below. The erased name still lives within us, if you believe that African spirituality still pulsates, even if disguised. Now that you understand who this God was and why Yahweh considered him a direct threat to the fidelity of the Hebrew people, you might be wondering, but if he was so present, so spiritually powerful, so worshipped by diverse cultures, why does no one know his real name today? How could a being revered by thousands, perhaps millions of people, simply disappear from humanity's collective memory? And here, we enter a crucial part of this journey, a part where spirituality mingles with power, where faith intersects with domination, and where the name of a deity doesn't disappear by chance. It is erased, intentionally, systematically, with almost surgical precision. The strategy of erasing a god from history doesn't begin with physical destruction. It begins with discourse. And the first step in this process is to transform that deity into an enemy, a threat, a forbidden idol. This is what Yahweh commanded. You read this in entire passages of the Torah and other books of the Old Testament. The order was not only to destroy the followers of the other gods, but also to destroy their names, their symbols, their texts, and any trace of their presence among the people. The names of these gods were not to be spoken. Their worship was not only to be forbidden, It was to be forgotten, silenced. This strategy was profound. It began with the destruction of temples, which were often not just places of worship, but centers for preserving spiritual knowledge, sacred calendars, music, dances, ritual alphabets, and oracles that guarded access to invisible realities. Temples represented portals connecting worlds. Tearing them down was like cutting the root of the tree of spiritual memory. Burning altars, toppling columns, burning sacred instruments. All of this was part of a spiritual cleansing, but with political, religious, and existential intentions. But the most dangerous and the most effective was not the destruction of the altars. It was the rewriting of history. The scribes, men appointed to record facts and perpetuate traditions, were instructed not only to write what happened, but to reinterpret, to filter, to omit, and above all, to replace. Texts were rewritten in the light of monotheism. Passages mentioning ancient gods were erased, names were changed, rituals were attributed to Yahweh, even when they clearly belonged to other cultures. You may not notice it at first glance, but the Bible bears signs of this spiritual cleansing operation. Silences that scream, absences that disturb, contradictions that denounce. Many scholars call this process theological violence, using the power of sacred words to erase another truth. But there's more. There are records that haven't even come down to us. Books that were deliberately excluded, like the so-called apocryphal books. Writings that were part of the tradition of various ancient peoples and contained accounts of other gods, other spiritual wars, other forms of connection with the divine. But these books were discarded. Why? Because they didn't serve the project of spiritual unity under one God, under one voice, under one permitted truth. Worse still, many of these books weren't just forgotten. They were persecuted, hidden, and banned. Some were destroyed in sacred fires. Others were secretly buried by scribes who disagreed with the total erasure of history. Even today, archaeological discoveries reveal fragments of texts that speak of entities that don't appear in any modern Bible. Names crossed out, titles hidden, manuscripts broken, incomplete, with fragments missing exactly where a deity's name should be. This is precisely where forbidden archaeology comes in. How many times have you seen news of discoveries that never made headlines? How many ancient objects were found with inscriptions in forgotten languages that contradicted the dominant narrative and were immediately sealed, taken by institutions that keep more than they show? There are artifacts today locked away in museums and universities that could tell the true spiritual history of humanity, but they remain hidden from public view. Because if they were revealed, they would challenge centuries of religious and institutional control. Do you realize now the scale of the operation? Erasing him from history was no accident. It was a decision, a project, a strategy that combined spiritual warfare with cultural domination. An erasure that began with the physical destruction of temples, continued with the censorship of sacred books, and culminated in the repression of oral tradition. Yes, because when books were banned, knowledge lived on in speech, music, and rituals. And for this very reason, the people who still transmitted these memories were enslaved, colonized, and silenced. And don't think that all this is in the past. Even today, religions of African origin are demonized, persecuted, and discredited. The echoes of erasure persist. When someone says that Orishas, Vodans, or African ancestors are the work of the devil, they are merely repeating a strategy begun millennia ago, transforming what was sacred into abomination, replacing living memory with fear, exchanging true names for silence. But there's something they couldn't erase, the truth imprinted in the spirit. Because even with the destruction of the sacred scrolls, even with the rewriting of the texts, even with the censorship of the apocryphal books, even with the concealment of archaeological finds, the truth continued to vibrate in the souls of those who carry ancestral blood. The connection with this erased African god lives on, perhaps in dreams, perhaps in inexplicable sensations, perhaps in deep intuitions. Perhaps in the moment you listen to this video and something inside you resonates, stirs, recognizes. And now that you know this, tell me, how does it feel to know that part of history was hidden from you? Do you believe there are names that were banned because they carried a spiritual force that challenged the powers of the time? Do you believe that your spirituality today is a complete reflection of the truth, or just a filtered, shaped, pruned fragment? If this touched you in any way, comment below. Erasure didn't win. This phrase, besides being an act of spiritual resistance, helps this content reach more people who need to hear this truth. Everything I've shown you so far points to intentional erasure, a spiritual war disguised as a religious narrative. But perhaps the most disturbing part for those who still insist on denying this truth is this. There is physical, concrete, material, visible evidence that this African god really existed. And these aren't theories. They aren't disconnected myths. They are marks etched in the earth, in clay, in metal, in stone, and in the bodies of entire peoples. Marks that haven't disappeared with time. They've simply been silenced by those who wrote the official history. Have you ever wondered why so many archaeological discoveries never reach the general public? Why are so many sacred objects found in excavations locked away in vaults and never displayed in museums? Why are entire texts ignored by religious institutions? Because these discoveries not only contradict the dominant version, they reveal what was purposefully hidden. They tell the story that was ripped from the books. They prove that the erased name was never forgotten by the earth. There are ancient inscriptions, some on carved stones, others on clay tablets, that reveal the existence of deities not found in any modern version of the Bible. Some of these names are closely related to African gods worshipped today. Symbols of these gods appear in the ruins of entire cities destroyed in biblical accounts. Underground temples discovered in North Africa and the Near East contain markings similar to those used in ancestral cults in Ethiopia, Nubia, and Kush. For example, there are spiral patterns carved into stones from the 12th century BC, which were used in spiritual ceremonies worshiping the earth's fertility and ancestry. These symbols also appear on ceremonial textiles found in African tombs and on amulets buried with priests. These objects, when analyzed by independent archaeologists, show clear connections to spiritual practices that were later demonized by Abrahamic traditions. This isn't just art. It's carved doctrine, printed teachings, and materialized spirituality. And why aren't these discoveries widely publicized? Because official archaeology, in many cases, is funded by institutions with theological interests. And the last thing these institutions want is proof that other gods existed, African gods, with so much power, so much influence, so much reverence, that they needed to be erased by Yahweh. This isn't neutral archaeology. It's about narrative control, the preservation of a selective truth. Did you know that there are dozens of restricted access archaeological sites in North Africa, especially in regions that were once the territories of the Canaanite, Moabite, and Ethiopian peoples, sites where intact offerings, plaques with inscriptions in nearly extinct languages, and small sculptures with features that don't represent any known biblical character but that coincide with depictions of African deities preserved in oral traditions to this day, have been found. In many of these regions, local people still tell stories about spiritual entities that were worshipped there, long before the arrival of the Hebrew prophets. These stories don't appear in books. They live on in the mouths of elders, in the songs of mothers, in the gestures of healers. But they are always the same stories. They are unwritten memories. They are spiritual archives transmitted with the soul. And even when scribes tried to eliminate all mention of these gods, traces of them remained in the deepest layers of history. For example, there are very ancient scrolls that contain words scratched out, covered with ink, or scraped with tools. And when restored with modern technology, these words reveal the names of forgotten African gods. Names that match sounds still used today in African-based rituals. Names that should no longer exist, but insist on surviving. And it's not just artifacts. Geography itself bears witness. There are ruins of buried temples, with structures oriented toward specific constellations of the African sky, places where sacred rituals were performed, where there was a connection between heaven and earth, between gods and men. These temples were almost completely forgotten until recent excavations revealed underground passages with inscriptions dedicated to an entity whose name is still being translated. But the pattern repeats itself. It's a name that never appears in scripture, but reappears in modern-day Afro-syncretic rituals. Coincidence? Or ancestry that survives by force? Most striking of all is how this evidence is treated not as revelations, but as threats. When independent archaeologists try to publish these findings, they face censorship, funding cuts, and veiled threats. Some publications are boycotted, others simply disappear. and the few that manage to publish something are labeled mystics, heretics, or conspiracy theorists. But the truth doesn't need institutional approval. It just needs to be seen with open eyes. If an African god had never existed, why so much effort to eliminate him? If he were irrelevant, why so much destruction? If he were merely an empty idol, why do we still feel his presence in symbols, in songs, in dreams, and in spiritual portals opened in places the Bible commanded to be closed? You may not see these ruins as you walk around, but your spirit recognizes them. When you hear an atabake drum, when you see a ritual dance, when you feel a shiver at certain words or images, perhaps you are touching an ancestral memory older than you imagine, something that survived the ashes, something that not even Yahweh could completely erase. And now I want to hear from you. How do you feel about this evidence? Do you believe that truth can be buried, but never destroyed? Do you believe there are still hidden signs waiting to be unearthed? If this part of the journey touched you, comment below. The stones still speak. This phrase will help this video reach more people who also carry within themselves the truth they tried to erase. You've come this far, and perhaps you're still trying to understand how something so great, so sacred, so present for centuries, could have been silenced to the point of nearly disappearing from the record. But the question that now needs to be asked is even more powerful. What if this God Yahweh declared war on, the one whose name was erased, the one whose temples were destroyed and whose symbols were cursed, never ceased to exist? What if even after millennia of persecution, he is still being worshipped, under a different name, with a different appearance, but with the same spiritual essence? This is where the story changes tone, because now we're no longer talking about the past. We're talking about the living present, the now. We're talking about the spiritual survival of this African god through syncretism. And this isn't theory. This is practice. It's vibration. It's culture. It's faith that endures even when they try to erase it. What happened to this god was what happened to many other elements of African spirituality. He survived erasure by changing his clothes. He hid in the folds of the diaspora. He crossed the ocean within enslaved bodies. He was protected by chants, codes, and dances that only the initiated knew how to interpret. When colonizers and religious institutions tried to eliminate the gods of the African people, the people responded with ancestral wisdom. They didn't erase them, they transformed them. This is how many African gods have remained alive within Afro-Brazilian and Afro-diasporic religions, such as Candomblé, Umbanda, Santeria, Haitian Vodou, Jamaican Kumina, and so many other spiritual manifestations spread throughout the Americas. And perhaps you haven't realized it, but that African god that Yahweh wanted to erase from history is still here, alive, strong, worshipped, revered, just with different names, different voices, different expressions. Think about it. How many times have you seen an image of an Orisha, an Inkis, or a Vodun and felt something different? A spiritual recognition you can't explain? How many times have you heard the beat of an atabake drum and something inside you stirred, as if called, as if remembering, even if you don't rationally understand what's being said? This isn't folklore. This isn't superstition. This is spiritual memory. The divinity that Yahweh tried to erase continues to influence thousands of people in Brazil, Cuba, Nigeria, Colombia, Haiti, Suriname, Bahia, and the Recôncavo region, in the toreros of major capitals, and even in small altars hidden in discreet homes. It manifests itself through entities that go by different names, but carry the same ancestral vibration. This is the case of Zango, for example, who in many syncretic traditions is associated with Saint Jerome or Saint John the Baptist. But before that, he was already known as a force of justice, balance, and spiritual mastery over fire and thunder. He may well be a reinterpreted face of this god, fought against, feared, and erased by official narratives. Another example is Ogum, often associated with St. George. Ogum is the lord of roads, war, technology, iron, and movement. His archetype is that of the spiritual conqueror, the one who opens paths where everything seems closed. If we consider that the erased god was a force of resistance against Yahweh's spiritual oppression, Ogum carries traces of this force intact. And there are also female entities, such as Yemanja or Oshun, who embody the maternal and creative aspect of the African divine, a dimension that Yahweh, often depicted with exclusively masculine and domineering traits, rejected. The balance of power was a central principle in African spiritual traditions. The feminine was not secondary, it was central, it was power, it was life. This also disturbed the patriarchal model that prevailed with monotheistic theology. But the most striking thing is realizing that these entities, these names, these divine expressions, didn't need the approval of the great religions to survive. They survived in the people, in the body, in the incarnate faith, and even after being demonized, persecuted, burned in public squares, ridiculed in religious discourses, they are still here, in the drumbeat that rises to the heavens, in the incense smoke that carries prayer and gratitude, in the dance that draws an alphabet on the ground that the soul understands. Do you realize the enormity of this? We're not just talking about cultural resistance, we're talking about spiritual persistence. The erased African god survived not only because his followers resisted, but because he never stopped being God, even under another name, even in disguise, even hidden. And he continues to act. He continues to manifest in dreams, visions, trances, and messages that transcend logic. Many who today call themselves Christians, Muslims, or spiritualists are, unknowingly, connected to this same God through practices inherited from their ancestors. When someone lights a candle for protection, when they say an intuitive prayer to nature, when they thank the rain, the wind, the sea, this is ancestral spiritual memory, speaking louder than doctrine. This is the vibration of that God still echoing through the centuries. And don't think this presence is limited to temples or toreros. It's in art, it's in music, it's in body language. It's in the strength with which a once oppressed people continues to rise up, create, love, dance, pray, and live. This God is alive in the rhythm of capoeira, in the swing of samba, in the power of denunciatory rap, in the hope of the black people who still resist. He is present everywhere where spiritual truth doesn't bow to religious imposition. That's why erasing this God completely has always been impossible. Because he doesn't depend on scripture. He doesn't need a pulpit. He doesn't demand marble temples. He lives where there's an awakened soul, where there's a heart connected to its origin, where there's reverence for ancestry and the courage to say, I remember. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe this God is still alive among us? Do you feel like you've had contact with him, even without knowing his true name? Have you ever felt something spiritual so strong, so pure, that it couldn't be contained in the words of traditional religion? Comment below. Ancestry lives in me. If you felt this message resonated with something that was dormant within you. So far, you've walked with me through territories many avoid. We've entered sacred places that have been desecrated, heard silenced voices, and touched upon truths that never reached your ears in sermons, services, or religious schools. And now, after all this, I ask you a question that may echo uncomfortably within you. What does this revelation change in your spiritual quest? Because yes, it changes everything. Absolutely everything. If the African God that Yahweh tried to erase remains alive, even under another name, even hidden in syncretism, even on the margins of official traditions, then your faith, your belief system, your very understanding of divinity may be based on an incomplete history, and that is profoundly spiritual. Think with me. For how many years, for how many generations, have you been taught to reject everything that didn't come from a single religious source? How many times have you been told there is only one path, one truth, one salvation? How many times have you been made to fear the spirituality of your ancestors, as if it were evil, pagan, or demonic? Now you know that much of what you were taught was built on erasure. It was written by hands that feared the power of what came before. And if the foundation of your faith was shaped by this fear, does it connect you to the source, or does it distance you from it? This question isn't meant to make you abandon what you believe. It's meant to free you. Because spirituality isn't a prison, it's revelation, it's expansion. And from the moment you understand that Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, had to declare war on an African god, and that this war wasn't just theological, but existential, you realize there's something much greater behind the pages of the Bible. It's not about choosing between one God or another. It's about recognizing that your connection to the sacred may have been limited by power structures, by discourses created to centralize control of faith, to to transform the invisible into something domesticated, organized, and authorized. And this is where the deeper question arises. Was your faith born of the Spirit, or was it shaped by religion? True faith liberates. It connects. It rebuilds roots that have been severed. And when you realize that your spiritual roots were forcibly torn away, that your ancestors were forced to forget the name of their God, that their culture was criminalized, that their rituals were hidden, and that to this day there is shame in acknowledging this origin, you understand that the conflict is not over. It continues, but now it takes place within you. You feel it, because your body carries this memory. Your bones hold this history. Your spiritual intuition doesn't lie. It pulls you toward something that has always been there, on the margins, yes, but pulsating. It whispers in your moments of silence, return to the origin. But at the same time, the fear that has been planted in you since childhood screams louder. This is wrong. This is dangerous. This is sin. Do you perceive the conflict? This is what Yahweh created, not just a war against another god, but a war within every person who carries ancestral African blood and has learned to reject their own spirituality. And the question that won't go away is, how long will you continue to feed this war within yourself? Understanding that an African god was erased isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a spiritual call. It's a summons for you to look within, to face the void created when you were told the sacred could only come from a book, a pulpit, a pastor, or priest. It's time to face that perhaps your faith needs to be rebuilt, not by denying what you once experienced, but by reclaiming what was taken away, what was silenced, what was labeled wrong simply because it was too strong to control. And this control, let's be honest, is still at work. How many churches today oppose any form of African spirituality? How many use the name of Yahweh to justify intolerance, exclusion, and hatred? How many preach liberation when in fact they are instilling submission? This is the great spiritual tension of our time, the battle between religious control and connection with origin. The origin is uncomfortable. It demands that you look in the mirror and ask, who taught me to be afraid of who I am? Why do I reject what vibrates within me so strongly? Why do I distrust what is my spiritual right? The answer lies in your history, in the history of Black people, in the history of indigenous peoples, in the history of the oppressed, because their spirituality has always been too free to fit within the structures of dominant power. So what did they do? They extinguished it and replaced it with a controllable version. But the spark of truth remains alive, waiting for those who have the courage to rekindle it. And if you've made it this far, perhaps that spark is burning within you right now. Perhaps you're beginning to realize that you don't have to choose between faith and ancestry. You can have both. You can pray consciously. You can seek God deeply. You can honor Yahweh if you wish, but without denying what came before, without despising what Yahweh tried to erase. Because the spiritual isn't limited to names. It reveals itself in the truth that liberates. And the truth is that you have been separated from your roots. But now you know. And knowing is the first step to freeing your spirit. The second is to act. It's to seek. It's to listen. It's to feel. It's to break the chains of spiritual ignorance and allow your faith to be rebuilt on the foundation of truth, not fear. And for that, I want to invite you to reflect with me. Comment below. My faith will no longer be controlled. If you feel ready to rewrite your spiritual journey based on revelation, not just tradition. And after all we've revealed so far, every forgotten ruin, every erased name, every desecrated ritual, every hidden symbol, perhaps only one question remains. The most important of all, did Yahweh really win this war? Did the plan to erase the African gods succeed? Or was what seemed like victory merely a postponement of a greater truth, one that is returning now, with greater force, clarity, and urgency than ever before? Think with me. A war only ends when the enemy is dead. But the erased God is not dead. He is not completely forgotten. He is not completely destroyed. He simply retreated. He waited. He bided his time. Truth, when it is spiritual, does not need to win by force. It wins by permanence. It crosses centuries, crosses oceans, crosses slavery, persecution, and censorship, and still survives. And here comes a metaphor that carries the weight of everything we're experiencing right now. Truth is like water. Even when covered, dammed, or diverted, it always finds a gap. It always escapes. It always moistens the soil of consciousness until something new germinates, something that can no longer be contained. And what's sprouting now, within you, as you listen to all this, is exactly that. A spiritual call to ancient truth. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about revelation, what's been buried deep inside you, that strange feeling that something's missing from your faith, that uneasiness that arises when you repeat prayers that no longer resonate, when you sing songs that speak of freedom but feel trapped, when you read the Bible but wonder, why does this part seem to have been written by men afraid of losing control? This is all the water of truth trying to seep through the cracks of tradition. This spiritual war that Yahweh started hasn't ended because it wasn't a war between gods. It was a war for dominance over human consciousness. That's why it continues. That's why it's happening now, within you. Yahweh wanted to eliminate the competitor, but what he really tried to do was control the people's spiritual path, to eliminate the possibility of choice, to close the road that leads back to the roots. And that's precisely the most sensitive point of this entire revelation. There's no way to erase what's in the soul. No matter how many books are burned, how many images are destroyed, how many words are censored, the soul remembers. The spirit communicates. The ancestral connection doesn't need theological authorization to occur. The African god erased by Yahweh lives on, not because he survived on paper, but because he lives in the spiritual experience of millions of people. People who may not even know his original name. People who may never have consciously heard of him. But they feel it. They sense it. They intuit it. And that's enough for the war to continue. But now no longer as a battle between two powers, but as a struggle between fear and truth, between submission and freedom, between doctrine and connection. This is where you must choose. Because now that the breach has been opened, the water has already begun to leak. The truth is touching your mind and heart. And the spiritual choice before you is not about abandoning what you've already experienced. It's about expanding, broadening, reconnecting, reclaiming what was taken from you before you were even born. Why were you taught to fear African spirituality so much? Why is it that whenever you begin to approach it, guilt creeps in? Why does your body vibrate when you hear the drums, but your mind has been trained to recoil? Because this is also part of war. Yahweh may have won religious battles, shaped narratives, controlled peoples, organized empires, imposed codes. But he never managed to erase the seed of truth planted in the soul. And that seed is now sprouting in you. And it will continue to grow, even if they try to cut it down. Because spiritual truth does not die. It just waits. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. The attempt to erase this God has only strengthened it. Because the more one tries to hide the truth, the more it intensifies. The more it infiltrates the arts, culture, new generations, digital spaces, intertwined knowledge, forbidden conversations. It is flowing everywhere, and those with spiritual ears are already listening. Now tell me, did Yahweh really win this war? Or was what seemed like victory merely strategic silence from the wisest part of history? The one that knows that truth doesn't need to shout to assert itself. It just needs to remain? You already feel it. You already sense it. You already understand it. But understanding is only the first step. The second is responding. The third is choosing. The truth is calling, and it isn't comfortable, but it is liberating. And above all, it is yours. If this video touched something deep inside you, tell me in the comments. The truth has found the breach. This sentence will show that you're not just listening, you're awakening. And it will help this content reach other souls who are also seeking to reconnect with their origin. Like it now if you feel that something new, and at the same time ancestral, has been activated inside you. Share it with someone who needs to break through fear and open up to the spiritual truth that has been hidden. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because this message touched something very deep within you. And this is no coincidence. This is called spiritual. Now I ask you for 3 simple things, but they make all the difference. Subscribe to the channel right now. If you've made it this far, you're not here by chance. This channel is a space for revelation, truth, and reconnection with our ancestry. Here, we unearth what they tried to erase. So hit the bell too, because the next videos will delve even deeper. Comment below. I listened to the end, and now I'm not the same anymore. This comment shows that you're part of this awakened community and helps this video reach those who also need to wake up. Leave your like. Your like tells YouTube that this content matters, that it has value, that it deserves to be shared. And now the most important thing, watch the next video that is appearing here on the screen. It's the continuation of that journey, and it will show you what's still being hidden and why. You've come this far. Now keep going. The truth has already begun to flow into you.